So I drew out some rush measurements for these two tops because I'm making obviously two with that piece in the center. The final measurements I have written down, and I basically added 1/8 of an inch to each side, and then I got measurements for the rough cutouts. These are identical sizes, the two sides. It worked out that I had everything centered properly so they could be the same size, which would make my life easier. One panel down the road will become two separate panels, but I thought it would be easier to make this as two and cut one of them versus making 3 panels. I thought getting the sizes accurate would be harder that way. So in the last video you saw I made a bunch of cuts on some 1/2" MDF. It was a 4x8 sheet. The perimeter to this is thicker. It's about a little over an inch wide. I always do that on these torsion boxes. You want the perimeter to be a little bit thicker, especially since I'm going to be cutting into it. So I set up the radial arm saw to cut these lap joints. Very simple stuff. I did a couple test pieces. I got it accurate. I'm just cutting halfway down this piece, the same width as all the other ones, so that when they're connected it makes a flush surface. So obviously you'll see me making one of these torsion boxes, but I'm doing everything twice. MDF is terrible material. I hate it. It's extremely dusty. I have dust collection on, but I'm also wearing a mask, especially when I'm cutting this stuff. But the nice thing about MDF is, as far as sheet goods that you can buy, this one is going to stay the flattest. So that is why I chose to use it. It's also inexpensive. That is one of the plus sides of these torsion boxes. You can cover a large surface area by a fraction of the cost of doing anything else. So these marks, originally I was doing, I think, a 6-inch grid, and when I laid everything out, I decided to change it to 4 inches. So basically I'm going to have a 4-inch grid inside, which is 1/2" by 1/2" strips. So I wrote out how many I had to cut. In the last video you saw me bulk all that stuff out, so it was really simple. I just had the strips and I cut them down to size. I thought I filmed that, I didn't, but this is the final grid laid out on top of my piece. So I've done torsion boxes before, and one time I did it where I cut each lap joint. It took forever. So for this time I figured I can tape all of my long sides together, all of my short sides together for each box, and cut all of my laps at once. So that was kind of the way I figured that this would work, and I'm doing a 4-inch grid, and I'm doing that 4-inch grid from both sides. So in the middle, one of the boxes is actually a little off, but doing it the way I did it, that ended up working out. I didn't have to make any sort of special cuts. So I'm just making sure all this stuff is square, because I'm going to be cutting all of these laps through each piece at once. It's really important that all that stuff is square, and I just tape them all together. I did a test cut because now I have a 1/2" Dado stack in my saw. I got the depth right, made sure everything fit, and then in theory I could go through and cut all of these quickly, not one by one, and then it will fit together. So obviously for the perimeter, the laps are going to be a little bit wider. So you can see I have my 2 perimeters are on the outside, while all of my smaller slats are on the inside. And like I said, I pieced this out by box so that my sections didn't get too long. So this is all of my long lengths for one box that I'm cutting at once. I'm going to do those long sides first, like you can see there. And then I could just flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. So for each time I cut these, you don't always see it in the video, but each time I cut these, I'm cutting from both sides. So every setup I can get 2 cuts. And then the short lengths, which obviously there is more of them, so it's a longer stack, I could do the edges as well. So pretty simple stuff. Like I said, I have a dado stack in there, so I'm cutting that whole joint at once. So I have one board that I marked everything out on, and I'm going to line these marks up with the saw. This will be the original cut. I'll mark everything based off of these. It was very simple. I just moved my stop down, I lined it up with my marks, and then I can make the cut, and then that means that every single one of these stacks, my cuts will be in the exact same spot. So I apologize for a little bit of the fuzziness in this. I can set the camera up and have it focus, but sometimes when my hands move in and out of the frame close to the lens, it will lose focus, and it's something I can't really help because I'm not looking at the screen. But as you saw, I just moved the stop over. I can make that single pass of cuts, and I could flip this around and make the passes again. So you could see, since I'm coming off both ends, when I meet in the middle, because this isn't this piece was not divisible by 4, one of the middle pieces would have a smaller grid. I thought that might mess up the math for this, but it ended up working out perfectly because it's the same problem on the short sides, so that off-center piece was on this in the same position on both. And I just went through with all of them and did this exact same thing. You can see some of the pieces are rising a little bit, but I made extra care to make sure where I was cutting, I was pushing down as close to the blade as possible without getting into the danger zone, so that the depth of all of these would be the same. And obviously I put the tape where the cuts wouldn't be. So that is what that's going to look like. I could kind of test this and tell that all of these are lined up nicely. If at that point, if that stuff was looking off, it means I would have to change the way I was doing this. But everything was looking good up to that point. So it was just a process of taking this original. I kept moving it down, cutting those marks. Like I said, I could do both sides at once and finish this up. So this was I made, like I said, I made one of these where I cut all the laps one at a time. It lined up okay, but it took quite a while. This is a much faster way to do it. You just have to make sure that everything is staying. The tape's not moving or budging, but this blue tape is surprisingly strong. And like I said, I just did this with all of my pieces. So like I keep saying in the last video when I started the torsion boxes, this is a little bit more of a time commitment. But the reason I did this was because this piece was already, the materials for this piece was already quite expensive. And you can make a flat surface relatively inexpensively compared to making this out of hardwood. And it will stay flat over time because of the grid system. It also usually adds strength. That wasn't as big of a concern for this because it's just a coffee table top. It's not going to be holding a lot of weight. But the other problem is these tops are not attached to aprons. They're going to be attached to the hardware that lifts. So they're only going to be connected at a couple spots. So unlike a kitchen table where usually you attach all your sides to an apron and it will keep it somewhat flat, especially if you use breadboards, with a project like this, it's only going to be connected in the center in most parts to some hardware. So if I had made this out of hardwood, I could just see it bowing substantially over time. So this will just guarantee it stays flat. And it did give me an excuse to use my vacuum press, like I said in the last video, which I do enjoy doing. So right now I have all of my pieces sitting on top of the top piece of these is a single piece. The bottoms are pieced together. I had a little bit of an issue with that, which you'll see later in the video. But I did that to save money. Like I said, these sheet goods are really expensive at the moment, and I would have had to buy two, because this is a little over 2 feet wide. I would have had to buy 2 more sheets of plywood to have the bottom a full sheet, so this saved about $100. It ended up working out, but the bottom pieces did shift on me a little bit. But all I did was I added glue to all these while they were still together, which is also a time-saving process. I didn't want to put too much glue on there, because if you put too much glue on the laps, it will actually create a void in the space, and it's harder to get these together. But I roughly had this laid out, and I just went through and I did my perimeters first. It was a little hard snapping these together at first, so at one point I switched over to a hammer because these are very tight, accurate joints. So it's so tight, you'll see as you put this together it will actually start bowing, which is one of the reasons the vacuum press is so handy. You do not need a vacuum press to do this. I've done this with clamps before. The vacuum press just makes it a much easier process. And on a tabletop like this, I would have needed to go out and buy quite a few more clamps in order to do it accurately. You can see they're a little bit harder harder to get in there, but they snap into place pretty quickly once everything's aligned. And once I had the first few in place, it went much quicker. I just worked my way down the piece, snapping all these together. You can really see the flat surface of the grid starting to form at this point. And like I said, it was just a process of going all the way down the piece. I'm using Titebond 3. This glue has an open time of about 22 to 25 minutes, so I am moving quite quickly in order to get all this together before that glue starts to set up and I can get it in the bag. I'm just adding a substantial amount of glue to the one side of this, because then I will flip it and I'll add glue to the other side as well. So then I can flip this whole grid, and then I'll put some brads in place to attach it just lightly to the top side, so it doesn't, this stuff will move around on you in the vacuum press bag. There's so much pressure involved with it that it will move on you. And then I could piece out the top. Now the top I did add brads to as well, but you'll see a little bit in this video, but probably in later videos, they at one point, one of the pieces moved on top of the other. It was already in the bag. There was nothing I could do about it. I think this would have worked if I would have used veneer tape on those seams instead of brads. But like I said, it is the bottom side, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But things to think about piecing together pieces like that, I would suggest doing something a little bit sturdier than just a few brads. I thought it would hold, and it didn't. And I could just slide it into the box and start using the vacuum press and check out the progress as I go. You could kind of see at this point where the seam is starting to move, and it just created a ripple. And then at this one spot you could see the black void because there was a little bit of a gap, and as the air is removed from this bag, you can visually see that it's pressing everything down and removing that gap, which is pretty cool. So I made sure on all the sides that it did that. There was a couple spots where it didn't really want to go down, and I lightly hammered it to pop it in place. But once all the air is removed, you can see there's no big voids, no gaps. I have my gauge set perfectly where I want it. I got all that stuff from Veneer Supplies. This is not a sponsored video. I just like their website, and they ship things quite quickly. I've had no problem with the quality of the products I've gotten from them. If you're looking for a setup like this, that's the first place I recommend checking. And like I said, you could see a little bit better that seam being popped in that view. And then I could just, the next day I came in, I took this out of the bag, and then I could start finishing these up. So the finishing process for this is going to be very similar to the centerpiece. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly because I went into it in depth on the last one. It took me 2 days to make these because I let them set up for quite a while in the vacuum bag. So that is really the only downside to this. It's not necessarily a huge amount of work, but it is time intensive. So between the center portion and these two, you have 3 days of vacuum pressing just the tops. And then, like I said, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I went through it in the last video more in depth. I'm just going to route one edge of this, so then that routed edge could ride cleanly against my fence, and then I could rip these sides clean. The nice thing about this is I have an inch overhang on this whole coffee table, so obviously I want this to be 5 foot square, but if this is a 1/16 under or a 1/16 over, the customer's never going to notice. So that is one of the huge plus sides of having an overhang on tabletops. And then for the edges, I didn't have a great way to cut this in the shop. That wasn't going to take a long time. So if you put blue tape on the top side and the bottom side of a piece like this, and then run it through the radial arm saw, it really does help eliminate tear out. I pretty much completely eliminated the tear out by using the blue tape on this. It's the fastest way to cut these edges, but you just have to be careful because this saw will rip up the edges of this veneer. This veneer was thin a couple years ago. The quality of this cabinet grade plywood, in my opinion, has severely dropped off recently, so I spend extra time to make sure that I don't tear out those pieces because it's really hard to hide that in veneer. And then same process, I put my tall fence on my table saw. I'm going to use my Dado stack to make that groove around the entire perimeter. Like I said in the last video, the oak edge banding I'm putting on this, the solid oak edge banding, will wrap around the whole side, and I already cut up a bunch of that. Now I guess if you wanted to, you could use just sheets of plywood for this, but I didn't want to put that stick-on edge banding around the sides because coffee tables see a lot of wear and tear. My other issue with that is I work with plywood a lot. People think it is flat. It is not. It bows quite a bit, so that would have been an issue as well with the plywood. And then this is just showing you how I have all those pieces pre-fit, and then I could glue them together around that side. You can see how that tongue and groove that I cut in that oak and mitered all the corners, everything fits together nicely. I did have to use a seam on this. Once again, I already had this oak on hand. With all the material for this project, I was really trying to save the customer money. So some of this will have a seam, but once it's all finished, you can barely see that seam. And that is what my sides will look like. So this is just a cutoff that I have. You can see just how nicely that vacuum press pushes everything together. There's no visible voids. Everything will stay nice and flat. It'll be a super strong piece for this.